There's this quote by Michelangelo that says something like, if people truly understood how difficult something was going to be, they'd probably never start. So essentially, ignorance of the difficulty is sometimes necessary to begin. This seems like a great quote for new parents who just spent the third night with no sleep, but I don't have kids, so I'm going to relate it to this fixer-upper. Now, don't get me wrong, the renovation was brutal, but I also had to deal with a drug-related eviction before I even got the keys. I had a prisoner show up at my house and introduce himself in a way I will never forget. I had a mailman relieve himself in my backyard, not kidding, and the city was trying to give me citations throughout the entire process for simply trying to improve the ugliest house in my neighborhood. We're gonna get to all that, but first, let's go back to the beginning. Around 10 years ago at this point, which is crazy to say, I graduated from the University of Maryland with a degree in civil engineering. And like most new graduates, I was making very little money and found myself living with roommates, which was the worst. And I hated the idea of paying rent. I hated throwing money away every month to live in kind of a crappy housing situation. So I was determined to save up money and buy a house as soon as I could. But I was pretty broke, and the only way I could afford a new home was to have roommates to help pay the mortgage, which sounded pretty awful. Not as awful as someone pissing in your backyard, but hindsight's 2020. So I decided to get creative. After work, I would go through the tax records of the absentee owners in my area, meaning they own a home but don't live in it, so they're likely either renting it out or it's their second home. From the tax records, I was able to see who owned the home and how much they paid for it, and from that, I could see how much they likely owed on the house. If what they owed was in my price range, I would take their information, put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and send them a letter along the lines of, hey, my name's Andrew. I'm looking to buy my first home in the area. If you've ever thought about selling, I'd love to talk to you about buying your house. Now, I sent hundreds of these letters, and the response rate was probably like 2%. From the 2% response rate, most of them were politely declining my solicitation to buy their house, which is totally fair. I got a couple responses where people made it seem like what I sent them was the most offensive thing in the world, and I don't know what their deal was, but they were not happy. But eventually, I got a response from a gentleman who said, Andrew, I got your letter. I'm thinking about moving to Florida. I got a property in the area that I currently have some tenants in, and I might be ready to sell it. So later that week, I met with the homeowner, who we'll call Bob, at Panera, and we talked about the property. Bob told me that he had some tenants in the property that were good at first, but over the years they stopped paying rent consistently, and he got some reports from neighbors about some suspicious activity. Now, this probably would have scared off most people, but you should have met my roommates. So we set up a time to see the property, and here are some photos from that initial walkthrough. Objectively, not great, but when you're talking about problematic tenants, the last thing you want is for them to be strong. So at this point, I'm more than a little concerned. After walking through the house, I walked the neighborhood and I met the neighbors who, in a hushed tone, told me that there seemed to be a lot of cars that would pull up in front of the house and then leave after just a couple of minutes, and you can interpret that however you want. So at this point, 99% of people would probably have run for the hills, but I was desperate. I sent out hundreds of letters, and this was my best bet. My roommates at this point had some trash Jenga tower that was actually moderately impressive, as well as a sink full of dishes. I was over it, I was desperate, and so I decided to make Bob a semi-lowball offer, and to my surprise, he accepted it. And if you're like me, you probably want to know the exact purchase price, how much I put into this property, and what it's worth now, and I promise you I'm going to get into that in the video. In order to keep more money in Bob's pocket, I wanted to do this transaction without realtors, so I downloaded a Mickey Mouse purchase and sale agreement from the internet, and I printed it out and met Bob at a strip mall Mexican restaurant to finalize this deal. We set the closing date 60 days in the future to give the tenants plenty of time to pack up and move from the property. This also gave me plenty of time to get my ducks in a row for the mortgage, the down payment, and all that fun stuff. But I was excited to have my own property, my own fixer-upper project to work on. I was ready to move in. Everything indicated that closing was going to go smoothly. Apparently, Bob was talking to the tenants and they said they'd be out. Everything was looking good until about a week before closing when I got a call from Bob. Bob told me that the tenants were no longer returning his calls, they weren't answering the door when he knocked, and that this was probably going to get messy. Long story short, Bob had to initiate a formal eviction process, which took nearly 75 days, which wouldn't have been all that bad, except for the fact that my lease ended and I was basically homeless to the point where I had to move back with my parents, who were over an hour and a half basically from where I worked, for over 2.5 months, which was pretty brutal. But I persevered, and finally, I got the keys to my very first fixer-upper. Now, the median home value in this neighborhood at the time that I bought this house was around $300,000. But because this house was in disrepair and I was dealing with a motivated seller, I was able to purchase this property for just under $170,000. But keep in mind, this was like 6 or 7 years ago, before home prices went crazy. But the most comforting part was during the mortgage process, when the appraisal was performed, the appraisal value came in at $220,000. So if I'm buying it at $170,000 and it's technically worth $220,000, I basically made, around $50,000 at the time I bought the property, which was pretty awesome. Now, I'm going to tell you something that might be the most surprising part of this entire video. I bought this fixer-upper without any prior construction or renovation experience. My dad wasn't in the trades, I didn't really own any tools, I had no idea what I was doing, but I was born with the "how hard can it be" gene, and I kind of just figured, how hard could it be? And the answer was extremely hard. I had no idea what I was getting into, and that kind of goes back to the quote at the beginning of the video. If I knew how hard this was going to be, I never would have signed up for it, but I was kind of in the fire at this point, and there was no way out but through. So for each project, I would research it on the internet and watch a whole bunch of YouTube videos, and then I would save up until I had enough money to buy the tools and materials, and then just through trial and error, I would get something that looked usually just okay. My first couple projects were trash. Absolutely brutal, looked like a homeowner special, not great. But with each project, I gained experience, and it was kind of at that point when I figured, hey, if I'm learning how to do all these projects from YouTube, maybe there would be some benefit to me recording my own YouTube videos and showing a beginner perspective of somebody attempting these projects for the first time. And this was how Andrew Throne Improvements was born. And for those of you who have been watching and supporting the channel for a while, and you've seen all of these projects when they were done individually, I cannot thank you guys enough, which is why I'm trying to include some news stories and background information so that you're not bored stiff watching this one. And for some reason, I got super comfortable using concrete, so you might have seen that I've used it for quite a few projects here, including this concrete garden curb. So it's a little bit of a pain to set up and form, but for some reason, concrete and I just seem to get along. Now, some of you are probably wondering about the inside of the house, and transparently, that's where I focused all of my effort when I initially moved in, and all of these front yard improvements were actually some of the last projects I did on the house. So just because I'm showing these front yard improvements first, doesn't mean I actually did them first in terms of the renovation order. Now, compared to where this house started, the curb appeal is 1000% better, but when I showed it to you guys, there were definitely some haters down in the comments. And it was the haters that peer pressured me into ripping off my roof to try to build something crazy, but we'll talk more about this later. Let's head inside. So the original home only had one full bathroom, and after removing the carpet, I found that this whole thing had to be gutted. This was the very first project I tackled when moving into the home, and as I mentioned, the YouTube channel hadn't started yet, so the footage is rather limited. Now that remodel was nothing special, but at least it kept me from getting tetanus when I used the bathroom. The next project was the kitchen remodel, and I started by removing this partition wall just to find out that that column on the left looked like it might have been load bearing. So my brothers and I put up a beam to span across the kitchen, and after hanging up the cabinets and a whole bunch of off-camera work, I had a functional kitchen, which gave me the bandwidth to start the YouTube channel. Now, my first big break on YouTube came from converting this half bath, which was attached to the primary bedroom, into a full bathroom, which would take the bathroom count in the house from 1.5 to 2. Before buying this home, I don't think that I've ever seen a half bathroom attached to a primary bedroom like this. Let me know if you've seen that or if that used to be common back in the old days, but it's a bit odd. Anyways, I've been talking way too much, so I'm gonna quiet down and let the time lapse roll for the next 2 or 3 minutes. So this was obviously my first time building any shower like this, and I was pretty intimidated when I was trying to plan everything out. But ultimately, I decided to splurge and pay the extra money for the Curdy system just because it seemed to be the easiest system to work with. Like I mentioned, it's a bit more expensive than some other options out there, but it made it easier for me, and since it was my first time, I figured I should give myself an edge and try to give myself something that would at least make the labor a little bit easier. As I was installing the tile in the shower pan, I discovered that I am the messiest tiler known to man, and I think a lot of that comes from using way too much thin set mortar. Basically, whenever I would push the shower pan tiles down, a bunch of excess mortar would squeeze up into the grout lines, and I ended up spending about as much time cleaning out the grout lines as I did installing the tiles. So if you're watching this, make sure you don't apply too much thin set mortar. More is not always better. And speaking of more not always being better, I decided to do the most and go with a herringbone tile pattern in the shower, which probably tripled the amount of time it took to tile everything. So I think this was probably worth it overall just because I feel like it gives the shower a unique and custom look, but it really was a complicated pattern, and as someone installing tile like this for the first time, I didn't do myself any favors, that's for sure. And I also made the decision to apply epoxy grout just because I didn't want to deal with the grout staining and being ugly over time, especially if I'm going to be renting this property out. So I bit the bullet, installed the epoxy grout, and there's a reason that installers hate it. It dries really quickly, it leaves a nasty grout haze that you have to wipe down, but hopefully it ends up lasting forever. And as you can see right here, I still used too much thin set mortar and it ended up pushing into the grout line. So I really can't emphasize enough, if you learn anything from this video, make sure that you don't apply too much thin set mortar. And if you end up squeezing any of that mortar into the grout lines, clean it out while it's still wet using a sponge or a toothbrush, because if you let it dry, you are going to waste hours scraping it out. And another part of this project that was completely overkill was the tiling of the walls. Drywall works just fine, and in hindsight, I wish I would have just drywalled everything. Installing all of these wall tiles was such a pain in the butt, and if there's any issue with the plumbing or electrical later on, it's going to be so difficult to access everything. So this was probably a mistake, but I do think it looks pretty good. And if you see those big red things that I'm spinning on to all the spacers, those are leveling clips, and they make them in a bunch of different shapes and sizes. But essentially what those are going to do is pull the tiles in flush so that there's not a lip in between tiles. And the only way to convert this half bath to a full bath was to move the toilet from the back wall to the side wall. And the only way to do this while maintaining the code required clearances was to switch to a wall mount toilet. And the wall mount toilet hack is something to definitely consider if you have limited space. I have a renovation that I'm working on right now in my new fixer-upper, and I'm considering switching to a wall mount toilet just because that's going to make the space feel much more open. So if you have limited space, give the wall hung toilets a look. And because this shower is pretty small, it's about 32 inches by 32 inches, I got a bifold glass shower door, which I think fit the space pretty well. And as I already mentioned, this is an extremely small bathroom, so for the vanity, I decided to get creative and build something really small and low profile, and honestly, pretty cheap. I just grabbed a board, coated it in epoxy, and then I installed a vessel sink, which honestly I hate the look of, but for this project, it just seemed like the only way to make it happen. And the biggest reason for designing the sink this way is I just didn't want to have a vanity right when you walk in the front door that you can hit your hip or your feet on, so I think this was the best option, although I did give up some storage space. Now, for any of you real estate agents out there or realtors, I know there's a very subtle difference that can be offensive. I want to know what you think adding a full bathroom like this would do to a home's value. Granted, this is a very small full bathroom, but I still think it probably adds like $30,000 to $40,000 to the home's value having a full bath compared to a half bath. But I want to hear from you guys. And I thought about showing the final result of this bathroom right here, but I think I'm just going to wait till the end to show everything. Instead, let's head out back. So the backyard was in pretty bad shape. Such bad shape that one day, shortly after I moved in, I saw somebody walk from the front yard to the backyard, and I could not believe my eyes. They literally started peeing on the fence. Instead of interrupting them midstream, I waited for them to walk back to the front yard, and I confronted them, and they were immediately like, "Oh my gosh, dude, I am so sorry. I didn't think anybody lived here. It won't happen again. I am so sorry." And what made it even more ridiculous is he was in a delivery service uniform. I'm not going to say if it was FedEx or UPS or USPS. And after we spoke, he hopped back into his company issued delivery vehicle and I guess went to make his next delivery. So my theory is that he got into the habit of doing that maybe during the eviction process after the tenants moved out and there was no signs of activity over like 30 or 60 days. And after I moved in, he was just doing his usual routine when I caught him in the act. So a bit awkward for everybody involved, but that was the first and last time that happened. Or that was the first and last time I saw it happen. So because people were using the back of my house as a latrine, I decided that a fence was a good project to prioritize. But because I was on a budget, I decided to buy all the components individually. So I used pressure treated 2x4s as the fence rails and then pressure treated pickets that I attached individually, but it gave me a good excuse to buy a framing nailer. Now, this next project was completely unnecessary, but I've always been somebody who hates when trash cans are just kind of spread all around the house. They don't necessarily have a place and they stick out like a sore thumb. So what I wanted to do was build kind of like a little paver patio area with a privacy screen where it would basically be an alcove where I could park the trash cans when it wasn't trash day. And although I did like 99% of the labor on this house entirely by myself, my brother, who was going to PA school at the same time that I was working on the house, was living with me because it just made sense. His classes were right down the road. We were able to work out a nice labor for rent arrangement. Overall, it was just nice to have a second set of hands every now and again for those projects that are just made so much easier with a little bit of help. And here we are building that privacy screen for the trash cans that I alluded to earlier, and I do want to get your guys' feedback on the voiceover. I've been talking so much in this video, so if the voiceover is a little bit annoying and it seems like I'm talking too much, please let me know down in the comments and I can dial that back. But if you appreciate the commentary, also let me know and I'll keep talking. And at this point, I close the bathroom stall that is my backyard permanently with that gate. And if you're a man watching this video, I'm sure that at some point you've wanted to have your own luscious green lawn that you can maintain and have it looking like a golf course. And I wanted the same thing. The problem is that my backyard basically had no grass at all and it's in a pretty shady space. So I put down a bunch of topsoil, which apparently had the right soil constituents and pH, and then I planted grass seed that's supposed to thrive in shady areas. But I'm kind of anti-pesticide, so I didn't put down any weed killer, and I think that really hurt my results. I'll be sure to show you how the grass looked at the end of the video, but right now, I gotta build this deck. Now, despite having confidence to tackle a lot of projects and showcase them on the internet, I wasn't super comfortable showing everybody how to build a deck because I wasn't entirely sure that I built this one entirely correct and up to code. But one thing I am sure about is that wire railings look great, but they are a pain in the butt to install. So when I built the deck on my new fixer-upper, first of all, I documented the whole process because I'm sure that I built that one correct, and I installed an aluminum railing system that I think looks so much better. Here's a look at the deck I built on my new fixer-upper, and I'll link that video down below if you're interested. The existing shed on the property was complete trash, so I had to demolish that and I'm going to be replacing it with an incredible shed, but I want to show that shed at the end of the video. But to build anticipation, here I am installing some stepping stones going from the concrete patio to that new shed. Now, I don't know if this next project is an example of me being, resourceful or just plain cheap. But I didn't really feel like spending $1,000 on an exterior sofa for this deck, so I used some of the scrap lumber I had from the fence I built, and I built this custom outdoor sectional, and I actually have a dedicated video on this with free plans, so if you think it looks good when I'm done with it, you can build your own for way cheaper than buying a new one. But I will say the cushions were extremely expensive for this. Even if you get the cheap cushions from IKEA, you're still probably going to spend around $500 for the cushions. So even though I saved a bunch of money on the frame, the cushions, those will get you. And this next project I built custom, not for pricing reasons, more just because I thought it was a cool project and it was something that I wanted to tackle. I wanted to build my own forms, I wanted to use the concrete, so here's a look at a handmade fire pit table. And I'll be sure to show you that fire pit table in action at the end of the video. And I absolutely hate the look of lattice, so I installed this wooden paneling system as a privacy screen, and then I put up this outdoor movie screen for some outdoor movies. Now, before I show you the final result, let's head into the basement. With the upstairs of the home renovated, I finally turned my attention to the basement, which was just as much of a mess as the whole rest of the house. But because this house is so small, it's about 900 square feet upstairs, by finishing the basement, I would pretty much double the usable area of the home, taking it from 900 square feet to around 1,600 square feet. So it was something I knew probably should be done. Now, what I shouldn't have done is start with the stairs. I have no clue why I decided that the first project in the basement should be a stair remodel. This is a walkout basement, so maybe I was thinking that all of my access in and out of the basement for the renovations would happen through that other door, but I still put a ton of wear and tear going up and down these stairs during the renovation. So if you're gonna finish your basement, definitely don't start with the stairs. But I will say, for the stair remodel, you can either call me creative and innovative or cheap, because I was able to find a way to do this for like 200 bucks. I just used some 1/4-inch plywood to reface the treads and then put on some risers, painted it, and called it a day. Now, I am not an expert on the best way to frame out basement walls. Moisture was definitely a concern with the CMU walls, and I did a bunch of research and found that this waterproof foam insulation was probably the best bet to push up against the CMU before framing the walls traditionally. However, I got a bunch of comments saying that it would have been better to maybe leave a space between the CMU walls and the insulation. There's a bunch of different ways in which you can do this. This is just the way I went with, and hopefully it doesn't bite me in the butt later on. For any contractors who specialize in basement renovations, it would be super helpful if you could leave a comment down below explaining the right way to frame out basement walls, or just let me know that I did it right so that anyone watching this video can learn something. I have enough of an ego to know that I did some things on this renovation correct, but I'm also humble enough to know that I'm sure I made a ton of mistakes. So if I made a mistake, please call it out down below so that others don't repeat it. The last thing I want to do is lead someone down the wrong road, so any suggestions or comments, let me know. Now, I thought about using steel studs to frame the basement walls, but I'm just more comfortable with lumber, so I used a pressure-treated bottom plate, framed everything up with a framing nailer, attached the bottom plate to the slab using some Tapcon screws, and then just nailed it to the top. This right here is a California corner, and I used it in all the corners because it's going to make attaching the drywall later on much easier. Also, if you use California corners and you're real quiet, you can almost hear it saying, hey, make sure that you report this renovation to your local tax assessor's office so that they can get their fair share. So on that note, in terms of permitting, you won't believe it, but this basement was actually considered finished when I bought it. Granted, the before photos that I showed you were after I did a little bit of demo, but this was essentially a replacement in kind and not a completely new basement renovation. So I basically just, improved it. And because I did a little bit of planning, I knew that I wanted to have an electric fireplace right here, so I framed that out, and then I put in a piece of blocking so that I could hang up a TV later on. If you plan ahead and you install your blocking and all your framing beforehand, it's going to be so much easier than trying to do that after the fact. And despite all the local vermin and the neighborhood criminals loving my existing windows, I decided to swap out those old aluminum ones with some new vinyl basement windows. And I want to both shout out Jeff over at Home Renovation DIY and I guess hold him liable for my installation method for these windows. Basically, I just lifted it into place and then put a bunch of spray foam insulation around the perimeter and then used a little bit of concrete to grout it in and didn't use any screws. So hopefully that holds up. Jeff, I'm trusting you. Now, when I started these renovations, I told myself that I wasn't going to tackle any electrical or plumbing projects because that's a skill best left for professionals. And it really is. But I found that the fastest way to lose $1,000 is to do one of two things. One, you can walk into a casino and that's going to be gone in an hour, or you can hire an electrician or a plumber for 2 hours and that $1,000 is also going to be gone. So in order to save some money, I did a ton of research, watched a ton of YouTube videos, read the electrical code, yada, 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 and did a lot of the grunt work for both electrical and plumbing on my own. Then, as I was pretty close to finishing everything, I would call in a licensed plumber or electrician to have them look over my work, make any changes if needed, and kind of certify the installation. I didn't touch anything related to connecting the new circuits to the electrical panel. I let the electricians do all that. I just kind of ran the wire, drilled the holes. I just did most of the busy work that doesn't really require any skills. Now, assuming that you did everything correctly, instead of paying an electrician, 16 or 24 hours to wire your entire basement, you're just going to pay them for maybe 2 to 3 hours to look everything over, make the final electrical connections to the panel, and if you did anything wrong, they can correct it hopefully pretty easy. The risk is that if you did it completely wrong, it might even take them more time to undo what you did. You might waste materials. So there is a little bit of risk doing it this way, but I did enough research where I was pretty close. And if you want more information on this basement remodel, I put together a completely free ebook that just outlines everything I did to make this basement renovation possible. It's completely free. I'm not asking for money or anything. It's just a compilation of everything that I learned during this basement renovation. So that'll be linked down below. Now, if I have one word of advice for you, if you're going to finish your basement, it would be to hire out the drywall. Drywall is brutal, especially if you don't do it for a living. It's going to take you twice as long to get a professional looking finish. There's going to be dust everywhere. It is horrible. So my recommendation would be to hang all the drywall yourself, do a good job so that the drywall finishers don't hate you, and then pay a professional drywall finisher to come in, tape the seams, mud everything, and get it looking professional. It's going to save you a ton of time and you're not going to have to deal with the dust. So I highly recommend it. That's the one thing I would hire out if I did this project again. When it came to the walls, I just went with a standard paint job, but I decided to get creative with my quote-unquote entertainment center, and I applied this waterproof coating, and then I troweled on this concrete topper product that's supposed to look kind of like a faux concrete wall. Honestly, not super happy with how this turned out, but I was too far in at this point, and there was no turning back. Now, for the basement floors, I might have made a terrible mistake. First, I got all of the drywall dust mopped up, and then I applied an LVP flooring that had an underlayment and vapor barrier attached to the bottom. However, I got a bunch of comments on this video saying that I should have installed a dedicated moisture barrier between the concrete slab and the flooring. So if there are any basement remodeling contractors who can comment on this, I would appreciate it. I'm crossing my fingers hoping that I don't have some kind of moisture problem in the future since the LVP I used has that underlayment integral to the bottom, but let me know down in the comments if I made a terrible mistake. And if you've never done any remodeling, luxury vinyl plank flooring is the easiest flooring in the world to install. I would say it's extremely DIY friendly, so it might be a good first project if you're trying to test out your skills. And if you plan to tackle any of these projects, I have detailed instructional videos on my channel for every project that you're seeing in this time lapse. So if you're curious, I have those on my channel, and you might want to consider subscribing if you like DIY content for two reasons. One, I would really appreciate it, and two, you might be able to save a ton of money and improve your house at the same time by doing these projects yourself. And I probably should have trimmed around the support column here, but I got a little bit lazy, and because my basement was a little bit light on headroom, I had to rip off the tops of my pre-hung doors. And if you have an older house like this one, chances are that the insulation is terrible and you can hear every footstep when you're in the basement from when someone's walking above, so I installed some insulation in the ceiling joists. And this next project was a bit controversial. I have always been a hater on drop ceilings. I think they look terrible, and 9 times out of 10, you should just install a drywall ceiling. But I was able to find a drop ceiling that had PVC roof tiles, which one, are not going to turn all brown and crusty when they get wet if they ever do get wet, like a standard drop ceiling, and I really wanted to have the flexibility to access the electrical and plumbing. Because this is an older house, I just felt like it was a better bet to leave that access open with a drop ceiling. Now, you can be the judge if this drop ceiling is better than drywall, or at least as good as drywall, but I think it looks pretty good, all things considered. I think these PVC coffered tiles look great, but the only downside is that you can't cut the coffered tiles for the perimeter, so I had to use a different style tile for the perimeters. Now it's time to tackle the final touches on the entertainment center. Now, I'm not sure if this is a green flag or a character flaw that I need to work out, but essentially, when I have a project in my mind, it's very hard for me to kind of shut it out and not actually execute on it, even if there are way more pressing and important projects that I really should be working on. An example of this in my basement relates to the furniture. Despite purchasing the couch from Facebook Marketplace for like $200, I really liked the idea of some custom coffee tables in that river table style that is now completely out of style. But I always wanted to build one of these, so I figured, why not do it now? And although I did like 99% of this basement renovation myself, I did hire out a plumber to do the under slab demolition and run the under slab plumbing to the bathroom I'm gonna be adding to this basement. And for those of you who have been counting, this house started out as a 1.5 bathroom home, and by the time this bathroom is done, assuming that I finish it, this house will have 3 full bathrooms. And although the plumbing was done well, they didn't do a great job finishing this concrete, so I had to go back with a self-leveling underlayment and get that floor even. And since I did a very complicated herringbone tile pattern in my upstairs bathroom, I figured that I earned a little break, and so I did this prefab shower system, which was way easier than tiling. And the one good thing about working on your own house is you can show up to work in your pajamas or work in bare feet like I did upstairs. Definitely not advisable from an OSHA standpoint, but hey, do whatever you want. And because I didn't do anything very fancy in this bathroom, it was pretty much a bare bones remodel that went pretty quickly compared to my half bath to full bath conversion that I did upstairs. However, the same sentiment I had for drywalling the basement, I have for this bathroom, which is hire out the drywall if you have the means and the money to do it. It's really gonna be super unprofessional looking. It's gonna take you forever. There's gonna be so much dust. If you're not a professional drywaller, it's usually not worth doing it yourself. And to keep things simple, I installed the same luxury vinyl plank flooring that I installed in the rest of the basement in the bathroom. My concern about moisture buildup between the flooring and the concrete still stands, but I'm still crossing my fingers and hoping that the underlayment and vapor barrier that's attached to the bottom of the LVP flooring is enough. Now, I like to install one luxury feature in every bathroom, and for this one, I went with an accordion style door to separate the bathroom from the furnace, which I need to have access to. So I get it, not the most glamorous, but it works for a basement bathroom, okay? And to try to make up for the tacky accordion door, I decided to install an LED bathroom mirror, which I feel like is a little bit nicer, and I really didn't have space to put a light above it, so this was kind of my only option. So I only had the plumbers do the rough-in plumbing under the slab, so it was up to me to finish off the plumbing in the rest of the bathroom. For the toilet drain line, I started by cutting off the stub flush with the slab, and then I pre-drilled some holes for some concrete anchors that I'm going to use to attach the toilet flange to the concrete after gluing and priming everything. And your grandfather might call this sacrilegious, but I decided to ditch the wax ring and go with this wax-free toilet seal. There were enough nasty wax rings that I had to deal with on this remodel, so I figured I would at least try something different that seems like it might be cleaner. I don't know. Now, although I'm not a huge fan of CPVC supply piping, there was CPVC piping already in place in the basement, so I figured I would just connect to it and run the new supply line to the toilet using CPVC, and I just stayed using CPVC with the supply lines over to the vanity that I'm going to install next. 9 times out of 10, I prefer to use copper pipe. And just like the rest of the basement, I stuck with the drop ceiling for the basement bathroom. Instead of doing the coffer tiles, I just did these plain white tiles. They're still made of PVC, so they're not going to get all gross if water ever hits them, but they're a little bit lower profile than the coffered type. And as I'm getting to the home stretch of this bathroom remodel, I have to add this exhaust fan to get all of that moist air from the shower outside. So I wired everything up, and then I had to buy this core drill bit from Amazon, which I'm probably going to use one time in my life to go through the CMU wall so that I could run the exhaust fan ducting from the bathroom to my home's exterior. Again, I didn't know how to do any of this beforehand, and I figured everything out by YouTubing it and Googling it, watching a few videos, and then I created a video of me installing it, so hopefully that helps other people out in the future. Although adding this bathroom to the basement definitely complicated the project, I really think it was worth it, and here's why. Essentially, with the bathroom and the entertainment center, this basement can kind of be an in-law suite, so to speak, and someone could come to town and visit and basically stay downstairs and kind of be fully autonomous minus the kitchen. They have their TV, they have their bedroom, they have their bathroom, and there really is no reason for them to come upstairs for anything besides food. But enough chit-chat, let's talk about cost. If I was to hire out this basement renovation, I think it probably would have been in the ballpark of $50,000. But because I purchased all the materials and did 99% of the labor myself, my cost was just a fraction of that. So believe it or not, I got a great price on the plumbers to do the rough-in plumbing under the slab, and that was only $2,500. The tub surround, and the vanity came out to $1,900. All of the lumber needed to frame the basement walls and the drywall came out to $2,000. All of the electrical fixtures like the wire, the recessed lighting, and the outlets came out to around $2,000. The LVP flooring came out to $1,300. The drop ceiling was pretty expensive and was just under $2,000. The doors and the windows were $1,150, and then all the miscellaneous costs for trim, paint, caulk, screws, things like that, I estimate that cost was around $1,000 to $1,500. So overall, I estimate that the cost to finish this basement was right around $16,000. And because this is around a 700 square foot basement, that comes out to around $22 per square foot just for the materials to finish a basement. Now, obviously, this doesn't account for the weeks that I spent renovating this basement on nights and weekends. So if you value your time, which you should, there's definitely a monetary component to that. And I have no idea why I built this weird barn door, but I did. Now, do you remember that old shed that I demolished in the backyard? Well, it's time to build my dream shed. This is one of those projects that I just had a vision of in my mind, and despite knowing that it was going to take me a ton of time and energy to build it, I just had to do it. So I'm going to let this time lapse roll, and you guys can let me know what you think. And a lot of you guys gave me a hard time for working in Crocs, and that's completely fair. They are the ugliest shoes known to man. Our whole family got those for Christmas one year. So they are very breathable, but they have not come out with a steel toe option, at least not that I know of. Now, when I was working on this shed by myself, I left the gate open and I was working with headphones in when all of a sudden I got startled by a guy who was right behind me in the backyard. He said something along the lines of, "Hey, sorry to trespass, but I heard you back here and I wanted to ask you a question." He told me that he was just released from prison and he was asking for a couple dollars so that he could catch the bus. So, as you might imagine, there are quite a few things running through my brain right now. First of all, if you've ever been in your own little la la land listening to music, you know how startling it might be to have someone come into your backyard and basically tap you on the back. So, I've got adrenaline coursing through my veins, I'm in fight or flight, I'm on edge. Second, I'm thinking, what kind of neighborhood did I move into where an ex-con showing up in my backyard is my reality? That was not on my bingo card. And finally, without thinking, I basically told him that I had a bunch of materials in the front yard for the shed, and that if he helps me move them all to the backyard, I'll give him 10 bucks. And that's exactly what happened. He helped me move the stuff to the backyard, I gave him $10, and that was weird. And as part of this modern shed build, I created free plans, and there have been a bunch of people who have built some awesome sheds using those plans. So if you want a project this spring or summer, building this shed might not be a bad one. So I'll link all those resources down in the video description. It's a pretty nice shed, it just is a little bit involved to build. And I realize that some of this looks a little bit out of order. Obviously, I didn't install the roof rafters until I installed the T111 siding, but I wanted to show all the framing first and then come back and show you how I installed this T111/smart siding. So a little bit out of order, but you get the picture. And I like to use PVC trim boards whenever possible. It definitely adds a bit of cost to the project, but I like the water resistance. I feel like it's probably worth it. Now for these front windows, I left a bit of overlap on the trim, and that way I could take this acrylic plexiglass and kind of push it up against the frame, and that way I didn't have to buy expensive glass, and this was kind of a cheap, inexpensive way to have some light in the shed. And I have no idea why I did this serial killer edit on the box cutter on the original video, but why take it out now? Now, this roll-up door on the front of the shed was pretty expensive, almost laughably expensive, but I figured that installing a roll-up door would really make the shed stand out, so I splurged, spent the extra money, and made it happen. In hindsight, I kinda wish that I installed a standard door on the side of the shed just because opening this thing and locking it and closing it every time is a little bit cumbersome, but it really isn't that bad. And I used asphalt shingles for the roof of the shed, which wasn't that big of a deal, but if I was gonna build this shed again today, I would probably just go with a metal roofing system. I think it would be a little bit faster to install, and I just think the metal roofs look nicer. And I want to take this time to give a shout out to those of you who have been subscribers of the channel and been supporting me for years now and seen all these original projects. I really do appreciate every single one of you who spends your time watching these videos. I really hope that you're getting some value and you're learning things when you watch them, and I really couldn't do this without you. So sincerely, I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. I really appreciate all the OGs, all those of you who have been with me from the beginning. So thank you, and I appreciate it. And you can't have a dream shed without lighting and some power. So I ran electrical from the house to the shed just so that I could have an overhead light, which would allow me to work in the shed after dark. And I also installed some side lights so that I could illuminate the yard if, wanted to play cornhole or do something in the yard after dark. So definitely a little bit of work, but I think it was worth it. And come on, you gotta have electricity in a dream shed. Otherwise, it's just a shed. Now, on the inside of the shed, I must admit that I went a little bit crazy, and this would be complete overkill, besides the fact that I wanted this shed to be a statement piece and have a lot of really cool features, mostly from a content standpoint. I wanted this shed to stand out, I wanted it to attract viewers, I wanted to have some unique features that would make this shed unique and help it to stand out from the pack, which is why I installed this epoxy flooring system, despite it requiring a ton of prep work, because you don't typically install epoxy on plywood. It usually goes on top of concrete. But after sealing all the gaps in the plywood, I was able to put down my base coat of white epoxy, and then I came in with kind of this metallic color as an accent before blending it all in. And although this was my first time using any kind of epoxy like this, I think it turned out pretty good. And after hanging up all the accessories and getting the shed organized, this project is complete. I'll show you the final result at the end of the video, but here's a look at my shed side by side with some other sheds that people built using my free plans. Now, the final project in this home transformation is to step up the curb appeal so we can silence the haters who compared the home to a polished turd. Despite not being nice at all, it's semi-accurate, and I think that by adding a gable porch overhang that we can get this house looking pretty dang good. And if you remember that concrete landing that I poured at the beginning of the video, well, I dug 2 deep footers below the frost depth because I always thought that adding some kind of porch overhang like this was a project that I would do in the future. And today is that day. Now, this was probably the most intimidating project that I tackled on this entire house, mostly because I'm going to have to rip off a perfectly good roof to try to add on a structure and then attach it to an existing structure. It's going to involve framing, it's up high. It was just a little bit scary, to be honest. And fortunately, my brother was around to help me out with parts of this because there is no way that I could have done this by myself. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Murphy's Law, which states that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And this project was certainly no exception. And here's me documenting that in the moment.
Okay, so despite checking the weather for days beforehand and checking the radar, we had this blip of rain show up out of nowhere. So now we're at the tarp house. Murphy's Law, man. Anything that will go wrong anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Something like that.
And so this storm came in the evening and lasted overnight, so we resumed everything in the morning, and that involved framing the actual structure. And I have a detailed video and ebook showing the entire framing process for this step by step that'll go through the details, but for this video, we're just going to show the overall process. Now, if you remember in the beginning of the video, I purchased this property for around $170,000. And although I didn't track every single cost associated with renovating this house, I have a pretty good idea of how much I spent taking it from where it was to where it is now. As I mentioned previously, the basement renovation cost around $16,000. The kitchen renovation was around $11,000. The shed cost $4,000, the deck cost $5,000, and the fence in the backyard cost around $2,000. The materials for this gable porch overhang were less than $2,000, but I did pay for a roof company to come in and re-roof the house, which cost $7,000. I paid $3,000 to have the asphalt driveway repaved, The materials for the full bathroom remodel in the hallway was around $2,000, and it cost around $5,000 to convert that half bathroom to a full bathroom. And I estimate that I spent around $1,000 on concrete bags that were needed to pour the new concrete entryway and the garden curb. For miscellaneous costs like paint, shutters, grass seed, things like that, I'm going to say I probably spent $2,000. And finally, I really didn't own any tools when I bought this house, so every tool that you see me using in this video, I had to purchase at some point over this 4-year renovation. So I estimate for all the tools, I probably spent around $5,000 over the years. So over the course of this 4-year DIY home transformation, I spent around $65,000 on materials and tools to make this possible. And although that seems like a lot of money, because it is, remember that I bought this property for $170,000. So with my initial purchase price of $170,000 plus the renovation cost of $65,000, my total investment into this property comes to $235,000. But the good news is that this whole area appreciated quite a bit since I purchased this property, and all my improvements added quite a bit of value to this home. As of 2026, the current market value for this property is likely in the ballpark of $440,000. So if I sold this property tomorrow, I would likely be walking away with a profit somewhere around $200,000. Obviously, there are realtor fees and there's going to be some expenses associated with that, but it'll be pretty close to 200K. But the real value is in the experience I gained. So when AI comes from my engineering job, I can always go to the trades. Now, after a couple final touches on the inside of the house, this project is complete. Let's take a quick reminder look at where this project started.
And here is a look at the final result.
So if you've ever wondered what happens when one man buys a fixer-upper and learns how to renovate it without having any prior construction experience, well, this is what happens. It will just take forever to complete. For those of you who have been following this journey for years now, I really appreciate your support. And for those watching for the first time, welcome to the channel. I figured it would be fitting to end the video on this half bath to full bath conversion project, since it was the project that really helped to jumpstart this channel. And if you want to help keep this channel going, I really would appreciate if you could drop a like down below. It helps me out with the YouTube algorithm, and if you like DIY content, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell, because I am knee deep in my next fixer-upper remodel. Thanks so much for watching, I appreciate you all, and God bless.